Imagine stepping into a lavish penthouse suite on the Upper East Side, where champagne glasses sparkle under crystal chandeliers, and hushed secrets lurk in every polished corner. In this glittering world of wealth, power, and privilege, one man's perfect life shatters when his alluring mistress demands the unthinkable. The resulting storm of betrayal and deceit turns his once idyllic marriage into a battlefield with a high-stakes divorce at its core. But just when he believes he's sacrificed everything for love, he discovers a new and more devastating truth that the mistress who demanded his soul plans to vanish with all of his riches. Jonathan Rutherford was not always a millionaire. He grew up on the outskirts of Phoenix, Arizona, sharing a cramped apartment with his mother and 2 siblings. His mother, Patricia, was a single parent who worked long hours at a local grocery store, rarely seeing her children during daylight. Nevertheless, she instilled in Jonathan a fiery determination to grasp every opportunity that came his way. By the time Jonathan turned 21, he had already created a small e-commerce business and sold it for a modest profit, fueling his drive to succeed even more. In college, Jonathan met the woman he believed was the love of his life, Evelyn Carter, a bright anthropology major, with a heart that seemed big enough to encompass the entire world. They bonded over midnight study sessions and summer road trips to national parks. Evelyn was kind, generous, and wholly supportive of Jonathan's ambitions. She believed in his dream to expand his online ventures into an empire, and soon after they graduated, they married in a small ceremony surrounded by close friends and family. Their early years of marriage were not glamorous. They lived in a modest apartment and worked tirelessly, Evelyn as a grant writer at a non-profit, Jonathan in the tech startup world. But as Jonathan's business acumen sharpened, so did their fortunes. A breakthrough came when he developed a software platform streamlining supply chain logistics, which garnered attention from major investors, including an early endorsement from Mark Cuban on a tech segment of a news channel. Within a decade, Jonathan became a millionaire many times over. His company, J. Ruth Innovations, was rumored to be on the brink of going public, promising to catapult his net worth into the stratosphere. Their lifestyle changed drastically. A penthouse in Manhattan, a sprawling estate in the Hamptons, even invitations to galas and charity events, frequently hosted by philanthropic luminaries. Evelyn and Jonathan once found themselves sharing canapes with the likes of Bill Gates at a fundraising dinner. While Jonathan thrived in this glittering world, Evelyn struggled at times to hold on to her sense of identity. She was proud of Jonathan, but felt overshadowed by the demands of his business dealings and constant traveling. Despite occasional friction, they remained a strong team, forging a partnership built on trust, loyalty, and shared aspirations. Little did Jonathan know that soon his carefully built kingdom would crumble, all because he opened his life and heart to someone else. A woman who promised him excitement, a spark he feared he'd lost in the day-to-day familiarity of marriage. One late summer evening, Jonathan found himself at an exclusive fundraiser at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Evelyn, preoccupied with a project for her non-profit, had chosen to stay home. Jonathan, reeling from a stressful negotiation process to take J. Ruth Innovations public, debated whether to cancel as well. But these events were essential for networking, so he attended, albeit reluctantly. Dressed in a sleek midnight blue suit, Jonathan drifted from one conversation to the next. A swirl of elegant gowns, black tie suits, and the soft glow of overhead chandeliers set the scene. String quartets played in the background as donors and socialites discussed everything from philanthropic efforts to the latest business trends. And then he saw her across the room, Bianca Rossi. She was tall, with dark, cascading hair and an aura of confidence that made her impossible to ignore. She wore a crimson silk dress that hugged her curves perfectly, leaving the onlookers, men and women alike, spellbound. Jonathan watched as she laughed effortlessly, touching the arm of an older gentleman who was explaining some detail about the exhibit. Something about her seemed entirely at ease, yet slightly dangerous, like a candle flame flickering in the dark. He didn't realize he was staring until Bianca's piercing brown eyes locked onto his. She offered him a half-smile, a silent invitation. Normally, Jonathan would have stayed on the periphery he was, despite his wealth, not a womanizer. He valued his marriage, or so he told himself. Yet that night, something in the tension of the preceding months, the dissatisfaction stirring in his spirit, made him walk toward her. They struck up a conversation that at first felt surprisingly ordinary. They commented on the art pieces, the turnout of the event, the excellence of the hors d'oeuvres. But beneath the casual banter, Jonathan felt an undercurrent, a magnetic pull from her that he couldn't resist. Bianca's eyes never left his, and her voice, laced with an Italian accent, caressed each word as though it were a precious gift. An hour felt like a minute. By the time the night ended, Bianca had made her intentions clear. She wished to see more of Jonathan. When he tried to exchange just phone numbers, she pressed a small embossed card into his palm with her personal address in Manhattan. The act was daring, unconventional, and it electrified him. As they parted, he couldn't stop replaying her last words. "Come find me when you're ready for something different." Days went by. Jonathan tried to focus on his company's upcoming IPO. He spent long hours in the office, preparing for investor meetings, coordinating with the marketing team, and smoothing out the final details with legal advisors. Yet the memory of Bianca's face and voice cut through his concentration like a blade. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw that crimson dress and her inviting smile. He attempted to shake off the temptation, reminding himself how much he loved Evelyn. She was the one who stood by him when he had nothing. She was his partner in every sense. But the more he told himself to stay away, the stronger the urge became. Finally, one night, fueled by whiskey and the stress of near-constant business calls, he found himself in a taxi, heading to the address on Bianca's card. Bianca greeted him at the door of an upscale apartment building on the edge of Central Park. The doorman let him in after a nod from her. Bianca's apartment was as alluring as she was. Every piece of furniture curated an intoxicating scent of jasmine and floor-to-ceiling windows, showcasing the city lights. She led him to her living room, offering him a glass of red wine that seemed to swirl with hidden promises. Jonathan felt out of his depth. He had never stepped out on Evelyn before. But Bianca's confidence, the subtle brush of her hand on his, and the whispered compliments disarmed him. The conversation flowed from world travel to art, from business to personal dreams. Bianca had a knack for feigning genuine interest in everything he said. She leaned in close, letting her perfume envelop him. Eventually, Jonathan couldn't resist. He leaned forward, and in the hush of that luxurious living room, they shared their first illicit kiss. It was like a drug, intense, thrilling, tinged with the sharp bite of guilt. That night marked the start of an affair that would shift Jonathan's entire existence off its axis. Affairs rarely remain secrets for long, especially not in the tight-knit circles of Manhattan's high society. Whispers sprouted. People saw Jonathan and Bianca dining at discreet corners of exclusive restaurants, or stepping out of black SUVs to attend private art shows where Evelyn was nowhere to be seen. Gossip columns started hinting at trouble in paradise for the Rutherfords. Paparazzi staked out near Jonathan's penthouse, hoping to catch a telling photo. Still, Jonathan believed he could keep everything under control. He rationalized his behavior. He still loved Evelyn, and he told himself he just needed an escape, a temporary thrill, But Bianca wanted more. She pressed him to spend more nights with her. She left suggestive gifts at his office, once sending him a handmade Italian silk tie with a note that read, "Something to remember me by in your boring board meetings." Torn between guilt and desire, Jonathan found excuses to be away from home for entire weekends. Eventually, Evelyn began asking questions. She noticed the change in his demeanor, how he kept his phone close, how he looked away when receiving late-night texts, how he no longer seemed as enthusiastic about planning their future. The once unshakable foundation of their marriage trembled. One Sunday afternoon, Evelyn confronted Jonathan. She demanded honesty, but he lied, insisting work pressures consumed him. She believed him at first. After all, Jonathan had a board of directors breathing down his neck about the IPO timeline. But suspicion lingered in her eyes. Jonathan's affair continued in secret rendezvous and stolen moments. And Bianca, sensing her grip on him tightening, began sowing seeds of dissatisfaction in Jonathan's mind. She spoke of how they could be unstoppable if he were free from all his old obligations. She fed his vanity, praising his intelligence, wealth, and power. Before Jonathan realized it, he was relying on Bianca for emotional validation he once received from his wife. Within months, Bianca's hold over Jonathan reached a fever pitch. She was no longer content being the secret. She wanted everything: his public commitment, his wealth, his devotion. Although Jonathan still felt pangs of love and loyalty for Evelyn, his marriage had grown cold and distant. The heated arguments, the prolonged silences, and the weariness on Evelyn's face all took their toll. In a move that stunned Jonathan, Bianca delivered an ultimatum. Over a lavish dinner in her apartment, she poured a vintage Bordeaux for both of them, then stated calmly, "If you want me to stay in your life, I need you to end things with Evelyn. I want you without any traces of your past." Jonathan felt a surge of panic. While he had fantasized about a future with Bianca, he had never seriously considered leaving Evelyn. There was more at stake than just an emotional bond. Their finances, business partnerships, and even their social standing were intertwined. A public divorce, especially one precipitated by an affair, would damage his reputation and quite possibly spook investors right before the IPO. But Bianca was unrelenting. She knew exactly how to play her hand. She threatened to spill every secret to the media if Jonathan didn't comply. "I have proof, messages, photos, gifts you've given me," she said with a smooth confidence. "You know the tabloids would devour it. What would that do to your company? Your precious IPO trapped by desire and fear of exposure." Jonathan found himself cornered. He thought about denying her, about calling her bluff, but he doubted she was bluffing. He had written her incriminating emails, left voicemails. The evidence was there for anyone who wanted to tear down his carefully built empire. But the heart is unpredictable. For Jonathan, a part of him had already started seeing a new beginning with Bianca, someone who matched his ambitions, someone who knew how to navigate Manhattan's high society with effortless charm. Gradually, he convinced himself that perhaps his marriage with Evelyn had run its course. And so, with trembling resolve, he agreed to file for divorce. Telling Evelyn was the hardest thing Jonathan had ever done. Late one evening, after a silent dinner in their penthouse, he mustered the courage to speak the words that would shatter her world. He confessed to wanting a divorce, leaving out the affair for the moment. Evelyn stared at him, stunned. Why, she asked, tears brimming. "We can work through whatever is happening. I still love you, Jonathan. I've always loved you." But Jonathan, under Bianca's spell and fearing Bianca's threats, stuck to a script of half-truths and vague accusations. He claimed they had grown too far apart, that maybe they wanted different things, that they needed to go their separate ways. The devastation on Evelyn's face was clear. She pleaded for therapy for any chance to salvage their relationship. But Jonathan, seeing no way out of the corner he'd been painted into, insisted that they should part. He avoided eye contact as he walked to the guest room. By the end of the week, he had moved out, taking a suite at the Plaza Hotel under a discreet alias, just as Bianca had suggested. The news of the separation leaked rapidly, intensifying rumors of Jonathan's infidelity. Although Evelyn tried to save face publicly, the heartbreak was evident. She moved back to their older residence in upstate New York to escape the prying eyes of reporters. Friends who had known them for years offered her sympathy and tried to glean information, but she stayed mostly silent. As Jonathan prepared for the divorce proceedings, Evelyn hired a lawyer to protect her interests, though her main concern remained the emotional betrayal. She still knew nothing about Bianca, but she suspected there had to be another woman. Jonathan's legal team was large and expensive, just as Bianca had recommended. The lawyers pressed Evelyn for a speedy settlement, leveraging the fact that Jonathan's wealth was mostly tied to the soon-to-be public company. Meanwhile, Jonathan felt torn between shame and the exhilarating sense that his life was transforming into something new and glamorous. Bianca, for her part, was thrilled. She made her presence known in Jonathan's world, showing up at business dinners and charity functions on his arm. Their relationship, once secret, turned into a public affair that made headlines on gossip websites. Millionaire tech mogul dumps wife for mysterious beauty, read one. Another sensational headline, teased behind the scenes of Jonathan Rutherford's scandalous romance. Evelyn's legal team attempted to secure a fair share of Jonathan's assets. She had been with him from the beginning, after all. But Bianca urged Jonathan to keep the settlement as low as possible, citing that a huge payout to Evelyn would hamper their new life. Jonathan's own guilt led him to offer more than Bianca wanted. In repeated arguments, Bianca insisted that Evelyn deserved nothing beyond a basic settlement. One day she snarled, "She never believed in you like I do. She was content with you being just a good husband, not a visionary leader. Don't let her walk away with your future." The irony was lost on Jonathan, who still saw Bianca as the greatest supporter he'd ever had, even though he had built his entire empire with Evelyn's unwavering help. As the divorce proceedings inched forward, tensions soared. Jonathan's IPO was delayed due to the negative press swirling around the scandal. Investors grew nervous about the stability of J. Ruth Innovations, with its CEO embroiled in a public split. Bianca, meanwhile, skillfully played the supportive partner, hosting lavish parties in her apartment, where Jonathan could woo anxious investors. She whispered to them stories of Jonathan's brilliance, praising him, while slyly reminding them how committed she was to seeing him succeed. Slowly the tide turned, and the IPO was back on the horizon. But behind Bianca's bold gestures of loyalty lay a cunning plan only she knew the full extent of. At last, a settlement was reached. The divorce was made final in a Manhattan court, with Evelyn receiving a considerable sum, though notably less than half of Jonathan's existing wealth. Her lawyer advised her to fight for more, but Evelyn was emotionally exhausted. She wanted closure, and to move on to heal from the betrayal. The judge signed the decree, and with that, Evelyn left the courtroom in tears. Jonathan returned to Bianca's lavish apartment, feeling a confusing mix of relief and sorrow. He told himself that, now that the divorce was behind him, he could focus on the future. Perhaps with Bianca's dynamic personality at his side, he could scale greater heights. But a part of him mourned the end of his marriage and the love he once shared with Evelyn. Late at night, he'd stare out the window at the city lights, wondering if he had made a catastrophic mistake. Bianca, however, appeared nothing but triumphant. She organized a celebratory dinner at Le Bernardin. In the glow of candlelight and the buzz of Manhattan's culinary elite, she clinked glasses of champagne with Jonathan. They toasted to new beginnings and unbridled success. Yet if Jonathan had looked more carefully, he might have noticed the calculated gleam in Bianca's eyes, or how she seemed more interested in talking about his assets' upcoming IPO and expansion deals than about him as a person. That very evening, Jonathan inadvertently revealed his plans for restructuring his finances post-IPO. He spoke of setting up a private fund, of shifting certain assets into easily liquidated stocks. Bianca listened attentively, nodding at all the right moments. By the time dessert arrived, she had gleaned enough details to formulate a cunning scheme. The day after the divorce was finalized, Jonathan received a call from one of his old college friends, Marcus Lynn, who had known both Jonathan and Evelyn since their freshman year. Marcus was a straight shooter, known for always speaking his mind. Without preamble, Marcus said, "John, I've been hearing things about Bianca. I don't think she's who she says she is." Jonathan bristled with defensiveness. "You don't even know her," he snapped. "What could you possibly have heard?" Marcus hesitated, but pressed on. "There are rumors. People say she was involved with a wealthy banker in London. A few years back, Robert Hastings rang a bell. He ended up losing. A fortune vanished from the social scene. She jumped ship right before everything fell apart for him. It's said that she left with a ton of his money. Maybe it's all talk, but there's enough chatter to be concerning." Jonathan's pride flared. He refused to entertain the possibility that Bianca might be conning him. After all, he was a savvy businessman. He had built an empire from scratch. How could he be fooled? He brushed off Marcus's warnings with an icy thanks for your concern. "But I know what I'm doing." Then he ended the call. Yet a seed of doubt was planted. Over the following days, Jonathan began recalling small inconsistencies in Bianca's stories, conflicting details about her family, about how she earned her money, about the places she claimed to have lived. He tried asking her subtle questions, but Bianca was adept at swiftly changing the subject. She'd distract him with flattery or physical affection whenever he probed deeper. At times, Jonathan noticed an unsettling quality in Bianca's eyes, like a cat sizing up its prey. But each time the alarm bells chimed, Bianca's charm overpowered his hesitation. He convinced himself that the rumors were mere gossip, spread by people envious of their relationship. Despite the turbulence of Jonathan's personal life, J. Ruth Innovations finally launched its IPO. The opening day on the New York Stock Exchange was a triumph. Stock prices soared, surpassing even the most optimistic projections. Jonathan rang the closing bell, wearing a triumphant smile, while Bianca stood by his side in a stylish white suit, beaming for the cameras. The press devoured every moment newly divorced tech mogul triumphs, with stunning IPO launch, blared the business headlines. That evening, an exclusive after-party was thrown at an upscale penthouse venue. Investors, celebrities, and tech industry heavyweights rubbed shoulders. Bianca played the role of charming hostess, impeccably draping herself on Jonathan's arm, ensuring each high-profile guest felt special. Evelyn was nowhere to be seen. She had been swiftly replaced in the public imagination by Bianca, the it girl, next to the newly minted billionaire. If Jonathan felt any trace of guilt or sadness, he concealed it behind the $1,000,000 smile expected of him. In private, Jonathan felt relief and a surge of pride. He'd finally reached the pinnacle of success he had long sought. Financial freedom was now absolute. He mused that perhaps everything his affair, the divorce, might have been worth it for this moment. With Bianca eager to explore new ventures, new mansions, and new investments, he imagined they would become a power couple to rival any in Manhattan. Unnoticed in the corner of the party, one of Bianca's acquaintances, a slick man named Darian Kendall, quietly sipped his champagne. An ex-private investigator and rumored blackmailer, Darian had ties to more than one suspicious incident in the city. For a moment, Jonathan and Darian's eyes met. An uneasy chill swept through Jonathan, though he couldn't quite place why. Bianca smiled at Darian from across the room, a knowing smile that left Jonathan perplexed. She then quickly pulled Jonathan away to introduce him to yet another VIP. The moment passed, but an intangible sense of dread lingered, flush with IPO wealth. Jonathan and Bianca relocated to a grand penthouse overlooking Central Park. Ornate fixtures and museum-worthy art pieces adorned every corner. Bianca took pleasure in redecorating importing hand-woven rugs from Morocco, ordering custom-made Italian furniture, and commissioning original paintings from up-and-coming artists. The cost soared into the millions. Jonathan said nothing, telling himself that he deserved this level of luxury after all his hard work. In between lavish shopping trips and glamorous parties, Bianca urged Jonathan to sign over certain assets in her name. Just a precaution, she insisted in case of legal or tax complications. He hesitated, but she used every method of persuasion at her disposal, her charm, their physical intimacy, and the convenient mention of the fear that Evelyn might try to reopen the divorce settlement if J. Ruth Innovations soared too high. Eventually, Jonathan relented. He signed over several properties into a trust that listed Bianca as a co-owner. After all, they were practically engaged, discussing wedding plans to formalize their union. The media devoured the love story, from rags to riches tech. Genius finds true love after divorce. Neither Jonathan nor Bianca contested the false notion that she was his newfound soulmate. The public had grown fascinated with them. Paparazzi followed them on exotic vacations to Saint-Tropez, Aspen, Bali. Everywhere they went, Bianca made sure to post carefully curated social media updates that showcased their extravagant lifestyle, fueling admiration and envy in equal measure. Behind the scenes, some cracks appeared. Bianca's temper flared if Jonathan questioned her spending or asked to see receipts. Arguments escalated quickly, only to be patched over by luxurious gifts or steamy makeup sessions. Jonathan's old friends scarcely recognized him. They noticed how Bianca controlled the conversation, how Jonathan seemed more guarded, more isolated from those who once grounded him. Still, Jonathan pushed aside any trepidation. He poured more money into their life together, certain that he was building the future he had always dreamed of. The new circle of acquaintances surrounding him offered hollow sycophancy, while the true friends from his past found themselves kept at arm's length. Beneath the glitzy veneer, a storm brewed. Slowly, Jonathan noticed strange financial discrepancies. Unauthorized transfers, suspicious charges, and large sums moving between accounts he had never opened. Each time he brought it up to Bianca, she waved away his concerns. "Oh, my accountant must have mislabeled the accounts. I'll sort it out." Or she would flash him a disarming smile, reminding him of how stressful it was to manage their blossoming fortune. Simultaneously, Darian Kendall lurked at the edges of their life, appearing at parties, dropping by Bianca's gatherings unannounced. Jonathan found him unnerving. Whenever Jonathan asked Bianca about Darian, she claimed he was an old friend who helped her set up her real estate ventures. Jonathan's gut twisted. Something about Darian's gaze, calculating predatory, put him on edge. But Bianca was so persuasive in dismissing Jonathan's fears that he let them slide. Nevertheless, Jonathan's old friend Marcus refused to stay silent. Marcus arranged a discreet meeting with Jonathan, away from the paparazzi's watchful eyes. In a dimly lit bar on the Lower East Side, Marcus revealed what he'd uncovered. Bianca's real last name wasn't Rossi. It had changed multiple times over the past decade. She'd been implicated, though never charged, in a series of financial fraud investigations in Europe and Asia. Several men who had been involved with her suffered mysterious bankruptcies and left the social scene in disgrace. Jonathan felt as though the rug had been pulled out from under him. But his ego chafed at the possibility he'd been conned. He lashed out at Marcus, accusing him of meddling and refusing to trust Bianca. "She's changed," Jonathan said through gritted teeth. "People can have complicated pasts. This is just gossip." Marcus shook his head. "I hope you're right, John, but I'm telling you there's more to this. Watch your back." With that, Marcus left the bar, his face etched with concern. Jonathan was left nursing a drink that tasted bitter, no matter how sweet the bourbon. Returning to the penthouse, Jonathan didn't confront Bianca immediately. Instead, he began quietly checking his accounts more thoroughly. He noticed that shortly after his divorce settlement, a series of funds had been diverted to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands. He couldn't recall setting up such an arrangement. He consulted his personal attorney off the record, asking about the nature of these accounts. The lawyer seemed puzzled. It looked like Jonathan's electronic signature authorized them. However, if one looked closely, the digital signatures were slightly inconsistent with Jonathan's usual pattern. "Digital forgery has gotten more sophisticated," the attorney said, a frown creasing his forehead. "Are you saying you didn't sign these?" Jonathan maintained a calm facade, but inside panic bubbled. He realized the looming possibility that Bianca, or someone working with her, could have forged his authorization. But confronting her would require evidence, and Jonathan suspected she'd be furious if cornered. His fear of scandal, of public humiliation, prevented him from moving openly. The tabloids would devour every lurid detail of a second betrayal. Even worse, the stockholders in his company might lose confidence in his leadership if it became clear that he'd been duped. Gradually, Jonathan decided to play along while gathering more evidence. He re-established discreet contact with Evelyn, not to rekindle romance, but to apologize for how things ended. He also sought to verify if Bianca had tried to sabotage Evelyn in any financial dealings. Evelyn still hurt, but Civil told him her legal team discovered suspicious questions about her settlement. The investigators representing Bianca had tried to pry into Evelyn's personal finances, apparently looking for anything that could reduce her payout. Evelyn's lawyers fortunately held their ground. As the days passed, Bianca sensed Jonathan was more distant, more distracted. She intensified her hold, demanding more attention, planning weekend getaways, spontaneously suggesting they look at private islands to purchase. She effectively isolated Jonathan from everyone except her new set of friends. Still, he concealed the emotional turmoil behind a polite smile, all the while building up a trove of suspicious documents and bank statements. The late afternoon sun cast long amber shadows across the marble floors of the penthouse. Jonathan stood by the window, a tumbler of scotch untouched in his hand, watching as the city blurred beneath him. Horns honked in the distance, helicopters buzzed overhead, but inside all was still. On the coffee table before him sat a carefully arranged stack of documents, bank records, wire transfers, and signature authorizations that made his stomach churn. He had rehearsed what he would say 100 times, but now that the moment was here, his mouth felt dry, and his thoughts scattered. The elevator chimed. Footsteps clicked against the floor. Bianca entered with the air of a woman returning from a victorious hunt, clad in a cream-colored designer dress, a silk scarf draped over her shoulders, and shopping bags dangling from one arm. She paused when she saw Jonathan standing so still. "Darling," she said brightly, "you're home early. I found the most exquisite lamp for the guest bedroom. We need to talk," Jonathan said flatly. Bianca blinked. "Is something wrong? Sit down." Her brows arched, but she sauntered over, setting the shopping bags on a velvet ottoman and sinking into the tufted leather couch. She crossed her legs and looked at him expectantly. "Okay. I'm listening." Jonathan moved to the table and picked up one sheet of paper. He didn't hand it to her, just held it up. "Explain this," he said. "A transfer of $5 million to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands, authorized under my name. Except, I never made it." Bianca didn't blink. "That's absurd." "Maybe your financial advisor," I spoke to him, Jonathan cut in. "He had no idea. Neither did my lawyer or my accountant. So either someone hacked into my accounts or—" He leaned forward, voice low and razor sharp. "You forged my authorization." Bianca's lips parted the first crack in her otherwise flawless mask. "Are you accusing me of stealing from you?" Jonathan dropped the document on the table and pulled out another, and another. Transfers. Trust alterations. Deeds. Her name was on everything. "I'm not accusing you," he said. "I'm showing you the evidence." Bianca's eyes narrowed, but she kept her tone even. "You've always been paranoid when you're stressed. Maybe you're just overwhelmed." "I had the signatures examined," Jonathan said. "Digital forensics. They match my signature almost. But not exactly. Enough for a court to question authenticity. Want to know what else they found?" He stepped back and pointed toward a folder labeled Bianca Rossi. "Aliases. You've changed your last name 4 times in 10 years. Bianca De Laurentiis in Milan. Bianca Varela in Singapore. Bianca Moore in London. Each identity is tied to a man with money who ended up broke or vanished from society." A long silence followed. Bianca didn't move. "Who are you?" Jonathan asked, quieter now. "Really?" Bianca's expression softened for a second. Then it hardened. She reached for her phone and stood. "I don't think you want to go down this road, Jonathan," she said smoothly. "You have a lot more to lose than I do." "Is that a threat?" he said. Heart-pounding. She opened a folder on her phone and turned it toward him. Dozens of screenshots, their texts, photos, voicemails, some romantic, some foolish, and others devastating if taken out of context. "If I go down," Bianca whispered, "I'll take you with me. These will be on every gossip site, every news channel by morning. Let's not forget your IPO. How do you think investors will react when they find out their golden boy got conned by his girlfriend and covered it up?" Jonathan clenched his fists. "You blackmailed me once into divorcing Evelyn. Now you want to do it again." "You're the one who gave me everything," Bianca hissed. "All I did was accept." Jonathan stared at her cold reality, crystallizing in his mind. She never loved him. She never even liked him. He was just the next mark. Bianca moved closer, her perfume sickening now. "I suggest you stop this little investigation of yours. Smile for the cameras. Keep playing the happy couple, and I'll let you keep what's left of your reputation." "I'm not afraid of you," he said, though his voice cracked. "You should be." For a long time, neither of them moved. Then Bianca gave a small smile, serene and sinister. She turned on her heel and walked to the bedroom. Jonathan collapsed onto the couch, the breath leaving his lungs in one shuddering gust. He'd spent years building an empire, yet he had never felt so small, so helpless, so utterly played. But even as fear wrapped its claws around him, something else stirred resolve. Bianca had underestimated him, and maybe that would be her first mistake. For days after the confrontation, the penthouse was a battleground wrapped in velvet and crystal. Bianca drifted through the space like nothing had changed, slipping into designer gowns and spraying her expensive perfume, hosting dinners, smiling for photographers. But something in her had shifted. Jonathan could feel it. Her movements were too calculated, her eyes too alert. She barely spoke to him now, unless it was in icy sarcasm or veiled threats. Jonathan tried to keep up appearances. At business functions, he wore his tailored suits and gave confident sound bites about expansion and growth. But behind the scenes, he was unraveling. Every night he lay awake, watching shadows dance on the ceiling, knowing that the woman beside him might ruin him with a single push of a button. His legal team worked around the clock, quietly preparing for the worst. His lawyers suggested trying to reverse the transfers or petitioning the court for injunctions, but with many of the assets already signed over, or worse, liquidated, their hands were tied. And if Bianca leaked the photos and messages she held, public sympathy would evaporate. Jonathan's only card left was silence. Then came the breaking point. One morning he returned from a breakfast meeting with his CFO to find the penthouse in disarray. It was subtle at first, drawers open a shattered wine glass in the kitchen sink. But as he moved from room to room, a knot of dread twisted tighter in his chest. The safe in his study was ajar. The folders with property deeds, offshore account ledgers, and private documents were gone. Bianca, he called. No answer. He checked her walk-in closet, empty hangers. Jewelry cases, all gone. Her perfume bottles still lined the vanity, but the drawers beneath had been cleared out. He walked into the kitchen, numb, and there, placed neatly on the marble counter, was an envelope with his name on it. He opened it. Inside, in Bianca's graceful slanted handwriting, were just 6 words: "You had your chance. Now it's mine." Jonathan staggered backward. Panic overtook him like a wave of ice water. He rushed to his laptop, opening his financial dashboard. The numbers didn't lie. 3 accounts drained. A luxury Hamptons property listed as sold. Company shares under his trust partially transferred to a dummy shell corporation. His heart pounded so hard he could barely think. He tried calling Bianca's phone, disconnected. He called their shared attorney. No response. He called his security firm and ordered them to review building footage. By noon, the head of building operations called him back. Bianca had left the building the night before with 2 men in dark suits, one of whom appeared to be Darian Kendall. Jonathan stared blankly at the wall. Darian, the quiet, eerie man who had lingered around their events. Jonathan had dismissed him as a hanger-on. Now he realized Darian had likely orchestrated the entire escape. Muscle, logistics, threats. He remembered the black SUV that had followed him the past week. At the time, he'd thought it might be paparazzi. Now he wasn't so sure. He called his lead attorney. "She's gone," Jonathan said hoarsely. "And she took everything." His legal team launched into emergency mode. They filed injunctions, contacted international financial institutions, alerted authorities. But Bianca had planned this meticulously. The accounts were in jurisdictions with strict secrecy laws. Shell companies obscured ownership trails. The homes and vehicles she'd sold were already in the names of intermediaries. Jonathan had no illusions recovering any of it would take years, if ever. And the humiliation would be public. 2 days later, the tabloids broke the story. Tech mogul's mistress vanishes with fortune, screamed one headline. Another blared, "From power, couple to public disaster." Photos of Bianca boarding a private jet at Teterboro Airport with Darian at her side flooded the gossip columns. A source claimed she used a fake name and paid cash for the flight. Customs had her final destination as the Virgin Islands. From there, nothing. Jonathan had hoped to control the narrative, but the press did what it did best: devour reputations. Old photos of Evelyn appeared in contrast, the loyal wife cast aside. Social media swirled with memes of Jonathan in clown makeup captions, like, "He lost the bag and the girl." Worse still, The board of J. Ruth Innovations demanded an emergency session. Though the company remained financially healthy, investors were nervous. Questions were raised. Had Jonathan mismanaged personal finances? Was his judgment compromised? One board member gently but firmly asked the unthinkable, "Would you consider stepping down at least temporarily? So we can stabilize the brand." Jonathan said nothing for a long time. Then he nodded. That night, sitting alone in a smaller apartment, he'd forgotten he owned Jonathan, stared at the city that once crowned him king. His phone buzzed. It was Evelyn, just a single message. "I'm sorry this happened to you." He didn't deserve her sympathy. But somehow it broke him. He sank into the couch and wept, not just for the money, not just for the humiliation, but for how willingly he'd handed his life to someone who had only ever seen him as prey. He had been seduced by fantasy. The next few weeks were a blur of chaos. Jonathan's attorneys scrambled to halt any further liquidation of assets, but Bianca had moved swiftly. Large wire transfers had vanished into overseas accounts. Shell companies with complex ownership structures obscured the money's final destination. Tabloids got wind of the scandal, publishing sensational articles. Mistress breaks tech billionaire's heart and bank account. They dug up every detail of Jonathan's divorce, from Evelyn painting him as a serial philanderer who had gotten his comeuppance. For every ounce of sympathy he received, he was also the butt of jokes, memes, circulated online, mocking his downfall. The blow to his reputation was severe. His company's board members tried to distance themselves from the scandal. Though J. Ruth Innovations remained stable financially, some stakeholders questioned Jonathan's leadership. They convened an emergency meeting to discuss whether his personal issues jeopardized the company's image. With mounting pressure, Jonathan announced he would temporarily step down as CEO, appointing a trusted colleague as interim leader, while he focused on resolving personal matters. Meanwhile, Jonathan tried in vain to trace Bianca. Private investigators discovered that she had boarded a private jet from Teterboro Airport under a false name. Customs records placed her final destination in the Caribbean. From there, her trail vanished. Darian Kendall was rumored to have accompanied her, or at least traveled on a similar itinerary. The investigators strongly suspected they had either used forged documents to continue traveling, or had found sanctuary in a jurisdiction with strict banking secrecy laws. Even more humiliating, Jonathan discovered that the forged signatures dated back months, indicating Bianca had planned her escape long before their confrontation. She had forced him to divorce Evelyn to cut off any claims Evelyn might have on the stolen fortune. Jonathan realized with a sickening jolt that he had unwittingly destroyed the person who truly loved him for the sake of a woman who viewed him as nothing but a resource to be exploited. In the aftermath, Jonathan was left reeling emotionally and financially. Though not entirely bankrupt, his fortune was dramatically diminished. Properties that Bianca had sold were gone for good, and the offshore funds might never be recovered. The press ate up every scandalous detail, further tarnishing Jonathan's once sterling public image as a visionary entrepreneur. He holed himself up in a smaller apartment he still owned downtown, one that Bianca had never touched. Alone in the dimly lit living room, he stared at the city lights with a sense of profound loss. Sleep eluded him. Guilt weighed heavily. He thought of Evelyn, the memories they shared, and how he had cast her aside. He drafted apology letters he never sent, typed out text messages he deleted. Above all, he regretted not heeding the warnings from Marcus, from friends, even from the pangs of conscience that occasionally haunted him during the affair. Evelyn, upon hearing the news, sent him a brief email that read, "I'm sorry this happened to you. I genuinely hope you find peace, but we can't undo what's been done." It was an olive branch of empathy, though it didn't promise reconciliation. Jonathan realized he had irreversibly broken something precious, and no amount of remorse would mend it. He replied with a simple heartfelt, "I'm so sorry. Thank you for everything." Desperate to salvage what remained of his life, Jonathan returned to the basics. He found respite in the same disciplined work ethic that had once propelled him from a modest upbringing to the heights of success. He sought therapy to address the guilt and confusion. He reconnected with some old friends, including Marcus, who helped him navigate the next steps without judgment. Legally, the authorities began investigating the fraud, but Bianca and Darian had covered their tracks well. At best, the investigators could charge them in absentia and issue international warrants. Recovering the stolen money was another matter entirely. A labyrinth of shell corporations and offshore secrecy laws likely protected Bianca's new nest egg. Jonathan's lawyers warned him it could take years, if ever, to recover a fraction of what was stolen. Meanwhile, J. Ruth Innovations stabilized under new leadership. Some board members urged Jonathan to sell his remaining stake and retire from the public eye. In a moment of clarity, Jonathan decided to hold on to his shares. He recognized that despite the scandal, the company was still his brainchild, and it held the potential to innovate and grow. Away from Manhattan's social scene, Jonathan gradually found a sliver of relief. He stepped away from parties and galas, focusing on meaningful pursuits. He quietly donated to causes Evelyn once cared about: women's shelters, education programs for underprivileged youth, though he did so anonymously. This was his small penance, his way of honoring the values he once shared with the woman he had so deeply wronged. Months rolled into a year, then 2. The media frenzy diminished. A new scandal, a different sensational story replaced Jonathan's downfall in the tabloids. He kept his head down, working from a modest office and occasionally consulting for J. Ruth Innovations. He no longer had that manic hunger for more wealth, more power, more success. The illusions that once blinded him had been stripped away. Still, the ghosts lingered. Bianca was never apprehended, though rumors occasionally bubbled up about sightings in Monte Carlo, Dubai, or private yachts off the coast of the Mediterranean. Jonathan learned to let go of the obsession with finding her. He recognized that the heartbreak, the betrayal, the financial losses were the consequences of his own actions and weaknesses. Forgiveness was hard to come by, especially self-forgiveness. Jonathan spent many therapy sessions delving into why he craved Bianca's excitement. He realized he had been seduced by not just Bianca, but by the notion that his life must constantly ascend to greater thrills. In his chase for external validation, he had lost the stability and depth that came from a real partnership. In time, Jonathan reached out to Evelyn again, more sincerely. Their conversations were guarded, but civil, then gradually became friendly. She had moved on with her life, finding work in community development, and it was whispered a new relationship that treated her with kindness and respect. There was no romantic reunion, no fairy tale ending for them. But they found a measure of closure, acknowledging that once upon a time they had shared a powerful love. With distance from the scandal, Jonathan began quietly rebuilding. He founded a philanthropic arm of his company to invest in educational programs, much like the ones that had shaped him in childhood. He sought to do good in ways he had neglected while chasing personal ambition. And in small pockets of time, he rediscovered simple pleasures: reading, hiking, watching the sunrise instead of partying until dawn. Though the scars remained, Jonathan embraced them as a painful lesson. He was neither fully undone nor entirely redeemed. He was a man who had been brought to his knees by temptation, betrayed by the illusions he cherished, and ultimately forced to reckon with the reality of his flawed humanity. 2 years after Bianca disappeared with his fortune, Jonathan Rutherford stood on the balcony of a modest brownstone in Brooklyn, far from the glittering penthouses he once knew. A gentle breeze carried the scent of fresh bread from a nearby bakery. He sipped his coffee, reflecting on the path that led him here. The tabloids had long forgotten his saga. The company he founded continued to thrive, albeit under new guidance. And Evelyn, the woman he had once loved so deeply, was finding happiness on her own terms. The world had changed, as it always does. Jonathan's illusions of invulnerability were shattered. Yet in the shards, he found a clearer reflection of himself. He was a man capable of poor choices, but also a man willing to learn and grow. The price he paid was enormous. His marriage, a chunk of his fortune, his pride. But the experience imparted a deeper wisdom. If there was any consolation, it lay in the hope that the lessons he had learned would guide him to a more grounded, more honest life. He closed his eyes, letting the morning sunlight warm his face. No longer the tabloid's favorite or the darling of high society, Jonathan Rutherford was just a person, flawed, vulnerable, and very much human. And for the first time in a long while, that felt strangely freeing. In the end, Jonathan Rutherford's fall from grace became a cautionary tale, powerful proof that even towering fortunes and lofty ambitions can crumble when built on secrets and betrayal. What began as a desperate search for excitement and validation ended in heartbreak, public humiliation, and the loss of untold millions. Yet from the wreckage, he found a thread of redemption in humility, self-reflection, and a return to the simple values he once cherished. Harold Davenport was the kind of man the tabloids loved to hate, handsome, wealthy, and never without a scandal. But no one ever expected this particular drama to unfold in the glare of high society's most exclusive restaurant, especially not with his pregnant wife sobbing in the middle of it all. In just one heated moment, Harold shattered more than expensive dinnerware when he delivered a stinging slap across Evelyn's face. Witnesses stood frozen cell phones out, capturing every angle of the betrayal. Within hours, the video went viral, thrusting Harold and the secrets he'd worked so hard to hide straight into the spotlight. Harold Davenport prided himself on two things: his ability to close any business deal and his impeccable public persona. If you walked into the towering glass building that housed Davenport Investments, you'd be greeted by smiling receptionists, crisp-suited assistants, and a portrait of Harold himself that exuded both charm and power. Behind the scenes, he navigated labyrinthine deals with an iron will. He had started from modest beginnings, something he rarely shared openly, to become the city's most lauded real estate mogul. His name peppered the society pages alongside glamorous photos of his equally sophisticated wife, Evelyn Davenport. They appeared to be the epitome of a power couple. Her shining brown eyes and perfectly styled hair spoke of poise and grace, the essential ingredients for playing the role of a millionaire's wife in high society. She was not just a trophy by any means. Evelyn held a master's degree in art history and curated exhibitions for a local gallery. Yet to the outside world, she seemed a mere ornament to Harold's unstoppable ambitions. Harold considered himself unstoppable until recently. He had just received news that Evelyn was pregnant. The idea of fatherhood was supposed to fill him with pride and joy. Instead, it felt like an inconvenient sidetrack to his grander life plan. Children meant cutting down on the lavish parties, the adventurous getaways, and the provocative dinners that often involved far more than just food. On top of that, business had been rocky for the past 6 months. Some said the real estate bubble in certain parts of the city was bursting and Harold was feeling the tremors. But he refused to show weakness. He doubled down on new developments, ignoring the warnings of colleagues. He had built an empire. How could it possibly crumble? Evelyn Davenport stared at the ultrasound photos pinned to her dresser mirror every morning. She was enamored with the tiny life growing inside her, but an undercurrent of dread also ran through her thoughts. Her marriage had once been built on genuine affection, but in recent months, Harold had grown distant. He'd come home late without explanation, skip important doctor appointments, and at times displayed a temper she'd never witnessed in their earlier years. She confided in her best friend, Fiona Bradford, who came from old money and spent her days juggling charity events. Fiona often told her, "Men like Harold are under immense pressure. Try to be more understanding." Evelyn did try. She planned romantic dinners, arranged quiet nights by the fireplace, and even suggested couples therapy. But Harold always brushed her off with a dismissive wave or an outright snub. This pregnancy, though a miracle to her, seemed to irritate Harold in a way she couldn't fully fathom. He was curt whenever she mentioned baby names or asked if he'd help decorate the nursery. Evelyn began taking notes on her phone of every small moment of love he did show, as though hoarding them like rare jewels, holding on to evidence that the man she married still existed. Complicating things further was the swirl of rumors she caught drifting through the city's upper crust. A mistress, some whispered. Others said they'd seen him at questionable venues late at night. She tried to remain hopeful to keep faith in the vow they had shared. After all, this was the man who'd once whisked her away for a spontaneous trip to Santorini just to watch the sunset on her birthday. Yet she couldn't deny the gnawing feeling in her stomach that something was terribly wrong. Serafina Rossetti was everything a scandalous mistress might be, statuesque, captivating, and dangerously ambitious. She had grown up on the outskirts of Rome, clawing her way out of poverty by using her wit charm and an unrelenting will to transcend her circumstances. Arriving in the city with no connections, she landed a job as a lounge singer in a high-end hotel bar frequented by the wealthy. That's where she first caught Harold's eye. Harold was drawn to Serafina's exotic accent and the allure of the unknown. As her smoky voice caressed the final note of a song, one evening Harold found himself enthralled. He approached her with the confidence of a man used to getting what he wanted. Serafina recognized him immediately. The local tabloids were filled with stories of Harold Davenport, the man who could turn a patch of barren land into a sprawling, money-making enterprise. She pretended not to care about his reputation or fortune, knowing full well how to play the game. Before long, they were meeting in clandestine hotel suites. Harold felt a rush with Serafina that had been absent from his marriage for far too long, at least in his mind. She was exciting and adventurous, feeding his ego in ways he didn't realize he craved. She would whisper how powerful he was, how unstoppable, and how much she admired him. It filled a void he had never acknowledged existed. To Serafina, Harold was a ticket to stability, and possibly much more. She knew the stakes. If she played her cards correctly, she might secure a future that far outshone her modest singing gigs. She feigned ignorance about his personal life, though she followed every development on social media. She told herself that if Harold was unhappy in his marriage, it was his problem to fix. She was simply the prize he deserved. The night it all came crashing down began as an extravagant date at La Belle Étoile, the city's most exclusive French restaurant. It was a place known for its crystal chandeliers, velvet drapes, and a menu that could make even the most seasoned gourmet swoon. Reservations were nearly impossible to procure. Harold, of course, knew the owner personally and had a private table set aside a lavish corner draped in gold and burgundy, offering both seclusion and prestige. He arrived with Serafina on his arm, and heads turned immediately. She wore an emerald-green silk gown that clung to her every curve, while Harold's tailored tux was impeccable. Waiters swooned with deference. The wine steward promptly arrived with an imported bottle of Chateau Margaux Vintage 1982, which Harold had pre-ordered at an astronomical price. Serafina loved the attention. She let out a seductive laugh at every mundane remark Harold made, batting her eyelashes as though he were reciting poetry. Little did she know that someone had recognized them. A discreet text was sent, and within minutes gossip started circulating through the upper echelons of the city's social network. Meanwhile, Evelyn sat at home, rubbing her growing belly, wondering yet again why Harold was working so late. She had made calls to the office, but each time an apologetic assistant told her, "Mr. Davenport is still in a meeting." When her phone pinged with a message from an acquaintance that read, "I think you need to see this accompanied by a grainy photo of Harold and another woman at La Belle Étoile," Evelyn felt her world tilt. Fueled by adrenaline heartbreak and a sense of determination she didn't know she possessed, Evelyn decided she had to see for herself. She hailed a car, ignoring her better judgment and every instinct telling her to stay home. She headed straight for the restaurant, tears threatening to spill from her eyes as she clutched her phone to her chest. When Evelyn arrived at La Belle Étoile, her heart pounded so loudly she could barely hear the maitre d' asking for her reservation. She spotted Harold almost immediately across the dimly lit room. He was laughing, his face turned toward Serafina. For a moment, Evelyn couldn't breathe. It felt surreal, like a nightmare that stubbornly refused to end. She managed to slip past the staff, fueled by raw emotion. She stood trembling at the edge of the table. Her presence was so unexpected that Harold didn't notice her at first. Serafina, however, lifted her eyes and froze. The expression on her face transitioned from smug delight to startled anxiety in a split second. Harold finally caught on. His laughter died, and a hush fell over their little corner of the restaurant. By now, curious diners at nearby tables were craning their necks to see the source of the disruption. Evelyn Harold, said his voice taut, "What are you doing here?" She couldn't quite form coherent words. Her throat felt like sandpaper as she uttered, "So this is how you spend your late nights." Before Harold could respond, Serafina tried to stand, but Evelyn's fierce gaze made her retreat into her seat. Evelyn didn't notice the staff edging closer to intervene or the scattered camera phones that rose from various tables. She only had eyes for Harold, whose face was now marked by anger more than guilt. Seeing the confrontation escalate, the maitre d' approached gently. "Madame, if there's an issue, stay out of this." Harold barked, eyes locked on Evelyn. Tension twisted in the air as onlookers waited, half in dread, half in voyeuristic fascination. Evelyn's hands shook, not with fear, but with a mix of betrayal and heartbreak she could no longer contain. No one could have predicted how swiftly the situation would spiral. Evelyn, tears brimming, whispered, "How could you do this?" "You know I'm pregnant, Harold. I'm carrying your child." Her voice cracked on the last word. Harold looked around painfully, aware that all eyes were on him. The empire he had carefully built on a foundation of public relations and polished appearances now stood on the brink of collapse. In his mind, Evelyn was violating the unspoken rule that all dirty laundry must remain hidden. She had broken the illusion he had painstakingly maintained, and for that, a flicker of rage ignited in him. It was a single impulsive motion. Harold raised his arm and delivered a stinging slap across Evelyn's cheek. The crack of his hand against her skin echoed in the hushed restaurant, shocking everyone into stillness. Evelyn stumbled back, her hand flying to her burning cheek, eyes wide in disbelief and pain. Serafina gasped, and several diners let out shocked cries. One or two even scrambled to stop him, but it was too late. The deed was done. As Evelyn steadied herself, the horrifying reality sank in. She was pregnant, vulnerable, and had just been struck by the man she once believed would protect her from all harm. Then the chaotic aftermath began. Concerned patrons rushed forward, some filming on their phones. A couple of women attempted to console Evelyn, while others shouted at Harold, calling him out for his abuse. Restaurant security threatened to call the police, but Harold, with his connections, somehow dodged immediate trouble. He stood rooted as if he couldn't quite comprehend what he'd done. Serafina was pulling at his arm, begging him to leave before the authorities arrived. Evelyn, tears streaming down her face, could hardly breathe. Her cheek throbbed, and her entire world felt as if it had collapsed in a single slap. The viral storm began even before the night was over. Multiple videos from different angles found their way onto social media platforms: Twitter, TikTok, Instagram. Within hours, Harold Davenport was trending, accompanied by hashtags like Justice for Evelyn and Stop Domestic Abuse. The public reaction was swift and merciless. Even those who had never heard of Harold Davenport before chimed in, condemning his actions as monstrous. By morning, local news channels picked up the story. Cynthia Morgan, a well-known news anchor, opened the day's broadcast with the scandalous footage. Experts chimed in, psychologists discussing domestic violence, lawyers speculating on potential legal consequences, and business analysts predicting the downfall of Davenport investments. If there was any doubt that Harold's reputation would weather this storm, it was erased by the sheer volume of denunciation flooding every media outlet. Evelyn, meanwhile, had spent a sleepless night at her friend Fiona's house. She found no peace there, either her phone vibrating constantly with messages of sympathy, outrage, and offers for legal counsel. Paparazzi were already camping out near the gates, hoping to catch a glimpse of her. It was surreal watching her private pain turned into a public spectacle. Harold woke up to a house that felt empty despite its opulence. News vans crowded the street outside his mansion. Every attempt he made to contact Evelyn was met with silence. Even Serafina tried to call him several times, leaving frantic voicemails, but he ignored them. Harold's PR team scrambled to manage the crisis, urging him to issue a statement apologizing for his actions and expressing contrition. But Harold was too proud and perhaps too shocked to act rationally. He believed he could ride out the storm, just as he had navigated countless controversies before. Late that same day, Harold received the dreaded official notice he was summoned to appear in court the very next morning. It was no longer a matter of social media backlash or public perception. Now he faced real legal consequences. The charge was assault on his pregnant wife, no less. The severity of such an act was enough for the district attorney's office to take immediate action. Bernard Stein, a high-profile defense attorney on Harold's payroll, rushed over to the Davenport mansion as soon as he heard the news. Stein had seen his fair share of celebrity and high society cases, but even he seemed rattled. In the gleaming marble foyer, he told Harold in no uncertain terms, "The footage is everywhere. We can try damage control, but you must appear remorseful and cooperative in court. This isn't a tabloid rumor we can simply squash." Harold seethed at this notion of having to grovel. "I built this empire," he snapped, pacing restlessly, "and I'll be damned if I let it crumble because of one slip. Evelyn. She provoked me. She showed up uninvited, made a scene. Stein cut him off. Do you hear yourself? That is not a defense. You slapped her. And she's pregnant. The public outcry alone is enough to doom you if we don't handle this very, very carefully. He stressed again the importance of a heartfelt apology, possibly even a settlement, anything to prevent a drawn-out criminal trial. Reluctantly, Harold agreed to follow Stein's guidance, but he refused to see Evelyn or even attempt a direct apology. Pride and anger still clouded his judgment, overshadowing any rational thought. His mind whirled with blame and resentment for Evelyn, for the diners who had filmed him, even for Serafina, whose presence had set the stage for the entire spectacle. While Harold prepared his defensive strategy, Evelyn faced a far more tumultuous emotional storm. She was holed up in Fiona's guest room, drifting between tearful breakdowns and bouts of numbness. Her cheek still bore a faint bruise, and every time she glimpsed her reflection, she felt a jolt of anguish mixed with disbelief. When she placed a hand over her belly, she worried not just for her own future, but for the innocent child growing inside her. Through the door, Fiona tried to coax her with tea-soft music or heartfelt reassurances. Evelyn appreciated the support, but she felt trapped in a nightmare she never asked for. A flurry of phone calls from advocacy groups, lawyers, and journalists only added to the confusion. While some demanded she press charges and make a public statement, others urged her to remember that Harold was a powerful man with the means to retaliate. Even her own parents, who lived in another state, left voicemails begging her to come home away from the media frenzy. Eventually, Evelyn allowed Fiona to connect her with a legal advocate named Janet Morales, who specialized in domestic violence cases. Janet arrived at Fiona's house, a calm, steady presence in the midst of chaos. She explained the legal options available to Evelyn, from restraining orders to possible civil suits. Evelyn listened quietly, feeling the weight of the decisions she needed to make. Her mind wandered to the early days of her relationship with Harold, their honeymoon in Bali, the nights they spent dreaming about their future, the moment they decided to try for a child. Each memory felt like a shard of broken glass, once whole and dazzling, now painful and scattered. Still, a determination flickered in her eyes. She wasn't just a victim. She was a mother, and she needed to protect herself and her unborn child, even if it meant taking the man she once loved to court. The next morning, the courthouse was abuzz with reporters, photographers, and curious onlookers. Police barricades lined the steps leading to the main entrance, where a swarm of media personnel jockeyed for the best vantage point. When Harold arrived in his sleek black sedan, he was greeted with an onslaught of camera flashes and shouted questions. Dressed in a tailored grey suit and dark sunglasses, he wore a stoic mask that revealed no hint of emotion. Inside the courtroom was surprisingly small and modest for such a high-profile case, the wooden pews filled with press and spectators. Evelyn and her lawyer Janet were seated at the prosecution's table. She looked pale and fragile, her eyes downcast, but there was a certain resolve in her posture. Harold glanced at her only briefly as he took his seat beside Bernard Stein. Judge Mary Kingsley presided, an astute woman known for her intolerance of theatrics. She addressed Harold's legal counsel, who motioned for a plea of not guilty. The charges read aloud included felony assault and battery on a pregnant spouse. The words echoed ominously through the hushed room. Prosecutor James Underwood wasted no time presenting the video evidence that had already become infamous. The room fell silent as the footage played. There on the screen was Harold's hand connecting sharply with Evelyn's cheek, her face contorted in pain, the restaurant crowd gasping in the background. Harold swallowed hard, but his expression remained guarded. His attorney argued that it was an isolated incident, fueled by extreme emotional stress, an out-of-character moment for a man who had led a charitable, community-minded life. The prosecution countered that domestic violence could never be excused by stress, especially when an unborn child was at risk. By the time the hearing concluded, it was clear there would be no quick resolution. Trial was set for several weeks later, and the tension in the courtroom felt like a coiled spring about to snap. In the days following the court hearing, Serafina Rossetti found herself in an awkward position. She had assumed that Harold needing her emotional support would whisk her away from the scandal and set her up in some plush hideaway. Instead, she found her calls unanswered or curtly dismissed. The few times Harold did speak to her, he was terse and irritable, as though she were now a complication rather than a thrilling escape. Serafina had her own problems too. Reporters had begun staking out the upscale condo Harold had rented for her. Some tabloids ran sensational headlines like, "The Other Woman." Serafina Rossetti speaks out. Even though she had given no interviews, offers from less reputable media outlets poured in, all wanting her exclusive story. Serafina sensed an opportunity. Perhaps if Harold was going to turn cold, she could profit from this mess in her own way. Despite her interest in monetizing the scandal, Serafina also harbored a flicker of concern for Evelyn. She never anticipated the situation would escalate into physical violence. Yes, she had wanted to supplant Evelyn as the woman in Harold's life, but witnessing a man strike his pregnant wife had jarred her. For the first time, she wondered if she was in over her head. One evening, she decided to contact Evelyn anonymously. She sent a brief, cryptic message. "I'm sorry for what happened. I never wanted it to come to this." She then quickly blocked the number, unsure of why she felt compelled to do so in the first place. That night, she remained awake, perched on her leather sofa, staring at the city lights outside her window. She had spent a lifetime fighting for a better existence, convinced that the ends justified the means. But as she peered into her own future, she suddenly realized she might be standing on a precarious tightrope, one misstep away from losing everything. Harold Davenport's PR team had never faced a crisis of this magnitude. Usually they managed to paint him as a charitable businessman, someone who hosted lavish galas for hospitals, sponsored educational programs, and revitalized run-down neighborhoods. But the video of him striking Evelyn was impossible to spin. The public condemnation was fierce, and major corporate partners began distancing themselves. Stock in Davenport Investments took a nosedive. Shareholders were panicking, and the board of directors discreetly questioned Harold's ability to continue leading the company. Not one to accept defeat, quietly Harold held a meeting in his opulent office suite. The walls were lined with modern art, each piece meticulously chosen to convey sophistication. But on this day, the art's tranquility did nothing to calm the anxieties in the room. Board members, anxious and distrustful, demanded reassurance. Harold paced at the head of the long, polished table, trying to maintain composure. "We need to control the narrative," he insisted. "I've directed my lawyers to talk settlement with Evelyn. We can handle this quietly if she—" One of the older board members, James Chapman, interrupted. "Harold, with all due respect, you assaulted your pregnant wife on camera. There's no controlling that narrative, and if we don't distance ourselves, we risk the downfall of the entire firm." Murmurs of agreement echoed around the table. Harold's jaw tightened. He insisted that the scandal would blow over if they remained united. But the board members exchanged doubtful glances. In the hallways outside, staff whispered uncertain if they'd have a job in a few months. That evening, Harold retreated to his penthouse office. The city skyline spread before him. He clutched a glass of expensive scotch, staring at the reflection of a man he hardly recognized. His empire was teetering, and for the first time in his life, he had no idea how to save it. As Harold's world collapsed, the people in his orbit took sides. A handful of his longtime associates tried to stand by him, offering moral support and private sympathies. Most, however, withdrew out of self-preservation. Invitations to elite events dried up. Charity galas quietly removed his name from the guest lists, and those who once clamored for a seat at his table now avoided him. Evelyn, too, witnessed a shift in her social circle. Friends who had previously envied her lifestyle now reached out with genuine compassion, offering everything from free daycare advice to assistance in navigating the legal system. Fiona remained steadfast, becoming Evelyn's de facto bodyguard against paparazzi and meddling reporters. Meanwhile, the press had a field day, highlighting every single detail of Harold and Evelyn's life. Newspapers dug into Harold's financial dealings, revealing questionable partnerships and uncompleted real estate ventures. Speculative pieces claimed Davenport Investments was on the brink of bankruptcy. Journalists camped outside Fiona's suburban estate, snapping photos through telephoto lenses whenever Evelyn ventured outdoors for a doctor's appointment or a walk. Harold was enraged by the intrusion, even though he had no moral ground to stand on. In a rare moment of vulnerability, he asked Bernard Stein, "Is there any chance Evelyn will drop the charges?" Stein's expression was grim. "She's pressing forward. And the DA's office has ample evidence. If it goes to trial, you could face jail time, especially considering the severity of hitting a pregnant woman." Faced with the real possibility of incarceration, Harold felt the first tremors of fear. He was used to controlling everything. His company, his reputation, his personal relationships. But now the grip he had on his world was slipping, and all he could do was watch it fall. Evelyn spent her days juggling medical checkups with legal consultations. The unborn child remained her top priority, and each ultrasound brought both hope and anxiety. Would the baby sense the stress roiling through her? She tried to soothe her mind with prenatal yoga recommended by her therapist. The sessions offered brief respite, but the looming trial kept her nerves on edge. Her therapist, Dr. Anita Green, encouraged her to confront not just the slap, but all the emotional abuse and neglect she'd experienced in the marriage. In one session, Evelyn sobbed as she recounted the nights she would wait hours on end for Harold to return home, only to be met with indifference or scorn. She realized that the violent act at La Belle Étoile was just the tip of a dangerous iceberg, and recognizing this made her simultaneously furious and fearful. Meanwhile, Harold's lawyers tried multiple strategies, proposing a private reconciliation, dangling a generous financial settlement, and even floating the idea of joint public statements about marital discord. Each offer was swiftly rejected. Evelyn was no longer the timid spouse who would do anything to keep the peace. The baby changed everything for her, instilling a fierce resolve to ensure a better future, free from deceit and fear. Late at night, Evelyn lay awake in Fiona's guest bed, replaying the slap in her mind. She saw Harold's eyes burning with rage, felt the sting on her cheek anew. For the first time, she truly comprehended the fragility of her own existence and her child's. She had loved Harold once deeply, but she couldn't excuse what he'd done. In that dark stillness, she resolved to see this through to the end, no matter how daunting the road might be. As the trial date approached, both sides engaged in a flurry of legal maneuvers. Bernard Stein filed motions to suppress certain witness testimonies and to dispute the chain of custody for the restaurant video. The prosecution, led by James Underwood, countered with motions of their own, seeking to highlight Harold's history of emotional neglect and to call Serafina Rossetti as a witness. Serafina found herself in a precarious position. She had no desire to appear in court, especially knowing that the defense would paint her as a gold-digging mistress. Yet she also sensed an opportunity to exact some form of revenge on Harold for discarding her so callously once the scandal erupted. After consulting with a lawyer of her own, Serafina begrudgingly agreed to cooperate with the prosecution's subpoena. The court of public opinion, however, was far swifter. The tabloids labeled Serafina as a home wrecker and the vamp who lured Harold astray. Commentators on morning talk shows debated whether she deserved blame or sympathy. Serafina found the sudden fame both alluring and terrifying, as she realized her once private life was now fodder for gossip and judgment. Inside Davenport Investments, the board of directors held emergency sessions without Harold. Rumors circulated about a possible ousting. Harold heard whispers about a management shakeup that would remove him as CEO. Each time the rumor reached him, it fanned the flames of his anger. He felt betrayed by the very people who had benefited from his leadership for years. Still, he clung to the hope that the trial might reveal the situation as a one-time lapse in judgment, at least enough to salvage what remained of his empire. But in his darkest moments, he wondered if the unstoppable Harold Davenport was truly unstoppable after all. Amid the swirling chaos, Evelyn received unexpected support from a group called Women First, a local non-profit dedicated to assisting victims of domestic violence. Organized by a determined activist named Sarah Hernandez, they reached out to Evelyn, offering counseling, legal resources, and even security if she felt threatened. Though initially wary of involving outsiders, Evelyn discovered a comforting sense of solidarity in their presence. Harold, in a rare moment of contrition, attempted to send Evelyn a bouquet of white roses and a handwritten note saying, "For the sake of our child, let's find a peaceful resolution." Evelyn never responded. She handed the note to her lawyer, who added it to the growing file of communications, unsure if it might be a ploy to manipulate the legal proceedings. Around the same time, a former employee of Davenport Investments named Marcus Lee came forward sharing that Harold had once verbally abused him in a private meeting. Marcus provided an affidavit describing Harold as a tyrant prone to explosive temper tantrums whenever challenged. While this testimony wasn't directly linked to Evelyn's assault, it added to the damning portrait of a man with little regard for those around him. Evelyn started to wonder if she ever truly knew Harold at all. She had been entranced by his charm, his success, and the beautiful life he offered. Perhaps she had been just another piece in his carefully curated public image. This realization fueled her resolve for justice. She began to understand that the trial was about more than just a single slap. It was about holding Harold accountable for a pattern of abuse. Late at night, she wrote in her journal, "I'm not fighting just for me. I'm fighting for every woman who's been silenced by fear, every child who deserves a loving home, and the future I want for my baby." The courtroom buzzed like a hive on the first morning of the trial. Long before the doors opened, reporters crowded the courthouse steps, their breath fogging in the early morning chill. News vans lined the curb like battle tanks, their antennas pointed to the sky. Inside every seat was filled lawyers, journalists, court staff, and a few silent strangers who just wanted to witness a man of power finally face justice. Evelyn sat at the plaintiff's table, her posture dignified but tense. She wore a simple navy dress and minimal makeup. She didn't need embellishment. The faint bruise along her jaw had faded, but the memory it carried still throbbed beneath the surface. Her lawyer, Janet Morales, sat beside her, focused, calm, and determined. Across the room, Harold Davenport entered, flanked by Bernard Stein and a second attorney. His navy suit was crisp, his hair carefully styled, but he looked thinner than before, his jaw tighter, his eyes a shade duller. The cameras had captured his fall from grace for weeks, but here under oath there would be no curated image, only truth. Judge Mary Kingsley entered promptly, the courtroom rising in unison. She surveyed the room with a cool, measured gaze before nodding to the attorneys. "Let us begin. James Underwood." The prosecutor stood and launched into a piercing opening statement. This case is not about business. It's not about society pages or philanthropy. It's about a woman, a wife, struck in public while pregnant. It's about a man who believed his wealth would shield him from consequence. But in this courtroom, we are all equal under the law. His words settled into the silence like weights dropped into water. When Stein took his turn, his tone was somber. Davenport is not a monster. He's a man under immense pressure who made a terrible mistake. We will show that this was an isolated incident, not a pattern. A moment of emotional failure, not cruelty. The real moment began when Evelyn was called to the stand. She walked slowly, every step echoing in the wood-paneled chamber. She placed her hand on the Bible, swore the oath, and sat down, clutching a tissue in her lap. Underwood guided her through the beginning, her marriage, the pregnancy, and the night of the incident. I walked into the restaurant, Evelyn said, her voice low but steady, and saw my husband laughing with another woman. I was humiliated. But more than that, I was scared. Scared because when I confronted him, he didn't apologize. He hit me. She paused, blinking back tears. It wasn't just the slap. It was the way he looked at me. Like I was the problem. Like I deserved it. The jury sat motionless. Some jurors looked at her with open empathy. Others scribbled quietly. During cross-examination, Stein treaded carefully. "Mrs. Davenport, would you say your marriage had challenges before this night?" Evelyn nodded. "All marriages do, but challenges don't excuse violence." Stein pressed further, attempting to imply her presence at the restaurant was confrontational. "You showed up uninvited, emotional upset. Is it possible things escalated too quickly?" Evelyn's eyes narrowed slightly. He didn't even hesitate. That was not escalation. That was a choice. Silence followed. Even Stein backed off, realizing he was dangerously close to pushing the jury the wrong way. As court adjourned for the day, Fiona met Evelyn in the hallway and wrapped her arms around her. "You did it," she whispered. "You told the truth." Reporters leaned over the barricades, microphones extended, but Evelyn kept her eyes on the door ahead. She hadn't walked out with justice yet, but she had walked in with courage. And that was the first step in reclaiming her story. The second day of trial began under a grey, unsettled sky. Inside the courthouse, a palpable sense of anticipation gripped every corner. Reporters lined the marble steps outside, speculating on what might come next. Everyone was talking about the witness expected to take the stand, Serafina Rossetti. She arrived at the courthouse in a dark sedan with tinted windows. Gone were the plunging necklines and camera-ready smiles. Today, Serafina wore a sleek black dress with long sleeves and her hair pulled back into a tight bun. The look was deliberate, composed, restrained, almost somber. The court bailiff led her through the back entrance, but not before a few quick shutter clicks from alert photographers caught her profile. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was electric. As Serafina walked down the aisle to the witness stand, Evelyn kept her gaze straight ahead, jaw tight. Fiona, seated beside her, offered a comforting squeeze of the hand. Across the room, Harold shifted in his seat, eyes unreadable. Prosecutor James Underwood began slowly. Ms. Rossetti, thank you for being here. Could you tell the court how you first met Mr. Davenport? Serafina's voice was low but clear. We met at the Grand Regent Hotel lounge. I was singing at the piano bar. He approached me after my set. And when did the relationship become romantic? Serafina hesitated. A few weeks later, he said he was unhappy in his marriage. I believed him. The gallery murmured. Underwood pressed gently. Can you describe Harold's demeanor during your time together? He was intense, controlling in subtle ways, but also charming. He made grand gestures, lavish dinners, gifts. But when things didn't go his way, his temper flared. She glanced briefly at Harold, especially the night at La Belle Étoile. Underwood nodded. Can you describe what you witnessed that night? Serafina inhaled. He was already tense before Evelyn arrived. He called her names, said she was always nagging him about the baby. When she showed up, he panicked. But what shocked me most was how quickly the slap came. 1 second, he was glaring. The next, he struck her. There was no hesitation. Gasps echoed through the room. Harold's eyes darkened, his jaw tight. Bernard Stein stood for cross-examination. Ms. Rossetti, he began coolly. How long have you known the prosecution intended to call you as a witness? A few weeks, she replied. During that time, did you speak to any media outlets? No. Did you consider selling your story? No, she said, a slight edge to her voice. But you must be aware that your name is now trending online. The mistress who helped take down Harold Davenport. That has value, does it not? Serafina didn't flinch. I didn't come here for value. I came to tell the truth. Isn't it true you continued seeing Mr. Davenport, even after knowing he was married? Yes, she said, her tone sharp now. But I never expected to witness violence. That changed everything. Stein backed off, sensing the jury was leaning toward her. She had delivered more than testimony. She had added depth to the prosecution's portrait of Harold as a man who didn't just lose his temper, but simmered with rage beneath the surface. Next came Marcus Lee, the former Davenport Investments employee. A young man in his early 30s, Marcus spoke with nervous energy. He recounted an incident where Harold screamed at him in a closed-door meeting and threatened to end his career over a missed contract clause. It was just paperwork, Marcus said, but he exploded. I walked out that day and never looked back. Though not directly tied to the incident, with Evelyn Marcus's account, bolstered the image of a man who used intimidation as a tool. By the end of day 2, the prosecution had laid out a pattern, not one of a single mistake, but of a man whose power insulated him from consequences until now. As the judge adjourned for the day, Evelyn caught Serafina's eye just briefly. For a fleeting second, there was no animosity between them, just the silent acknowledgement of a shared wound. By the 3rd day of trial, tension gripped the courtroom like a coiled spring. The prosecution had delivered a series of powerful testimonies, from Evelyn's haunting account to Serafina's damning implications, and now the defense was left with a singular risky strategy: put Harold on the stand. Bernard Stein wasn't fully confident in the decision, but Harold had insisted. He believed his voice could sway the jury, that his carefully practiced charm and narrative of stress and misjudgment might tilt the scales in his favor. After all, he had talked his way out of worse, or so he thought. The courtroom hushed as Harold rose, straightening his blazer and taking measured steps toward the witness box. The judge nodded. "You may proceed." He took a breath and began. "I grew up with nothing," Harold said, eyes flicking to the jury. "A one-bedroom apartment, a single mother who worked 2 jobs. I built everything I have through hard work and sacrifice. I've created homes for thousands, jobs for hundreds. I've supported charities, sponsored programs. My life has been about more than just profit." His voice was steady, each word calculated. "But with success comes pressure. The past year has been overwhelming. Cracks in the company boardroom, betrayals, business partners fleeing. It felt like my world was slipping. I wasn't sleeping. I wasn't thinking clearly. That night," I snapped. He paused dramatically, letting the silence thicken. "I never meant to hurt Evelyn. It was a moment of weakness. I regret it with every part of me." A murmur spread through the gallery. Some nodded sympathetically. Others remained unmoved, arms crossed, expressions stony. Then came the cross-examination. Prosecutor James Underwood stood, his tone clipped. "Mr. Davenport, you described a moment of weakness. Do you believe pressure excuses striking your pregnant wife?" Harold stiffened. "I didn't say it excuses it. I said it explains it." Underwood's eyes narrowed. "You were calm enough to order an expensive bottle of wine. You were composed enough to laugh with your mistress, to pose for photos. But when your wife appeared uninvited, as you put it, you lost control." Harold's face tightened. It wasn't just her presence. It was the scene she caused. She was confronting you, Underwood pressed, not for cheating, but for betraying the vows you made while carrying your child. Isn't it true you struck her not because of stress, but because she shattered your illusion of control? Objection. Overruled. Harold hesitated, clearly flustered. I felt cornered." Underwood stepped forward, voice firm. "Do you understand the risk you posed that night? Not just to Evelyn, but to your unborn child. Had she fallen, hit her head, lost the baby, would it still have been a lapse?" The room fell into complete stillness. Harold's throat bobbed. "Of course not. I regret it." "Regret doesn't erase action, Mr. Davenport," Underwood said sharply, "especially when that action is a violent assault." Stein winced slightly from the defense table. Harold's carefully built narrative was unraveling under the prosecutor's precision. After stepping down, Harold returned to his seat, visibly shaken. He leaned toward Stein, whispering something urgent. But his attorney's silence spoke louder than words. The damage had been done. In an effort to salvage the moment, the defense presented a slideshow of Harold's philanthropic endeavors, ribbon cuttings, charity auctions, photos of him handing oversized checks to children's hospitals. But to the jury, these gestures felt disconnected, like hollow set pieces in a life too carefully staged. From the gallery, Evelyn watched quietly, her fingers resting on her belly. The man on the screen, the smiling public hero, was not the man who had slapped her in front of a room full of strangers, not the man who had abandoned her emotionally long before that night ever occurred. As the day ended, Judge Kingsley announced that closing arguments would be heard the following morning. The jury would soon render their verdict. Outside, cameras whirred and anchors rehearsed their lines. Inside, Harold Davenport sat still, staring straight ahead. For the first time, He looked like a man who didn't know what came next. The courtroom felt like a pressure chamber ready to burst. After 5 days of emotional testimony, war confessions, damning footage, and countless objections, the air was electric with anticipation. Every seat was filled, even the overflow rooms packed with journalists and spectators watching via monitors. Evelyn sat flanked by her attorney, Janet Morales, and Fiona, who gripped her hand tightly. Her breathing was slow, measured, her eyes distant, as if she were trying to float above the gravity of the moment. At the defense table, Harold sat unusually still. Gone was the arrogant tilt of his chin, the impervious glint in his eyes. His hands were folded tightly in his lap, fingers interlocked, knuckles pale. Bernard Stein leaned in and whispered something, but Harold gave no indication he'd heard. His gaze was locked forward, staring into a future he could no longer control. The jury filed in each face, solemn, many avoiding Harold's eyes. The foreperson, a woman in her 40s, with firm posture and a trembling sheet of paper in hand, stood at the judge's cue. In the case of the state versus Harold Davenport, she began, her voice slightly cracking under the weight of the moment. On the charge of felony assault on a pregnant spouse, we find the defendant guilty. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom, followed by stunned silence. Harold's body jolted, his shoulders dropping, as if the word had pierced something vital inside him. Stein placed a firm hand on his arm, a silent, grounding gesture. The weight of the verdict hung thick in the air. Judge Kingsley's gavel struck once, commanding attention. Sentencing will be scheduled in a separate hearing. Court is adjourned. As the room stirred back to life, murmurs, whispers, and camera clicks erupted like distant thunder. But Evelyn heard none of it. Her eyes welled with tears, a silent flood of emotion, too complex for words' relief, vindication, heartbreak, and grief all mingling at once. She pressed her hand to her belly, whispering a silent vow of safety and strength to the child within. Harold remained seated for a moment longer, staring blankly ahead. Then, as deputies approached to escort him out for legal processing, he finally turned. His eyes met Evelyn's across the room. They held each other's gaze for a beat, hers steady, unwavering, his clouded with disbelief, perhaps even sorrow. But no words passed between them. In that final glance, something unsaid passed, a recognition that everything they had built was gone, shattered by the strike of a hand and the unraveling of trust. Whatever future Harold imagined, it would no longer include control, reputation, or redemption on his terms. Outside the courthouse, the press surged forward, but Evelyn remained shielded by Janet and Fiona. Sarah Hernandez from Women First stood nearby, offering a warm, silent smile of support. Evelyn looked up at the sky, the sun breaking through a blanket of clouds, and for the first time in months, she exhaled without tension. She had done the unthinkable, stood up to a powerful man, not for revenge, but for her child, for herself, for every woman who had ever been told to stay silent. And though the road ahead remained uncertain, co-parenting, healing, rebuilding, it was hers to walk now free of fear. The verdict wasn't just a ruling, it was a rebirth. And so ends the saga of the millionaire whose pride and betrayal sparked a dramatic courtroom reckoning. Harold Davenport, once considered invincible, now faces the very real consequences of his choices. Meanwhile, Evelyn stands as a testament to courage, showing that even in the darkest hours, hope and justice can prevail. As she places a protective hand over her growing belly, she looks toward a future in which her child will never know the weight of fear or silence. If this story moved you, if you found yourself rooting for justice and resolution, Please let us know by hitting the like button. Share it with your friends to spark important conversations about accountability and empathy. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more compelling tales that shine a light on the complexities of human relationships. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.